Does the federal government track and trace all the firearms in the U.S.? Well, the answer is a little more complicated than one might think. We'll start by saying, yes, they do. Because it was in 1968 that the Federal Firearms Act was enacted, and that established a firearm tracing branch of the federal government. Now, this is a little more complicated than one might think, because then in 1986, it was established by law that there cannot be any sort of a gun registry in the United States. So the U.S. Gun Tracing Division, which also is a branch of the ATF, is really kind of in a very interesting situation, because they're not allowed to use technology that would allow them to really go any further beyond the technology they probably had in the late 70s, early 80s, because it borders this concept of a registry. So it's one thing to trace firearms, it's quite another to have a registry. So how does all this work? Well, we'll start by saying that ultimately any firearm retailer in the country, as they sell guns, have to keep a record of that transaction. And that is in a form of a Form 4473. It's the application you fill out to pass a background check, and then that is kept as a record. Now, at any point, if this firearm tracing division needs to trace a gun, well, how can they do that? Well, let's say what they can't do is they can't trace a person. They can't go in and put in your name and figure out what guns you have. The only thing they could do is they can trace a firearm itself, but in order to trace that firearm, it can only be traced if it is the product of a crime. And ultimately what they have is they have boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes, like the last scene of the Rare's Lost Ark. There were so many boxes of these forms of 4473s, of these records, that they were fearful that the building would actually collapse. So they started buying metal containers. They have over 18 metal containers in their parking lot, all filled with Forms 4473s, or some sort of a copy of some sort of a record of a sale. They say they even have some records written on toilet paper that they've copied and then put in with all these other forms. So if there's a crime committed with a gun and that gun is recovered, then that police department will then put in for a tracing of that gun. And it'll start with the manufacturer, then it'll go to the wholesaler, then it'll go to the retailer, which ultimately then allows them to figure out, well, who purchased that gun, and then they go to that person. But unless a firearm is recovered from a crime, that process never begins. Now, it's kind of a well-documented fact that their success rate of tracking firearms is around 73%. Now, they do say that oftentimes a lot of the requests that they get for tracing the firearm is incomplete, meaning it might not have a serial number or even a make and manufacturer of the gun. They just have, like, well, this is a shotgun, and then they just say they can't trace it. Now, so that detours their success rate, but if given the serial number, their success rate is well over 95%, tracing where that firearm originated by the time it got to the criminal's hands. Where did that come from? But other than that, that's all they can do. And then their technology, again, is extremely limited because it borders on a national registry, which is illegal. So they have to kind of walk this fine balance between doing really everything the old-fashioned hard way to prevent from making a registry, and all they could do is trace guns given a serial number from a crime. Can't trace any old gun, it has to be from a crime. And then and only then can they trace that firearm, but they can't trace individuals, can't trace names, can't trace guns that are not used in a crime, that sort of thing. So again, it's a complicated question. Do they trace guns in the United States? Well, yeah, they do. But it's a little bit different than you might think. It's way more complicated than one might think, and it's really in an effort to not have a registry. It's extremely limited on their technological advances and what they can and cannot do there at the ATF. So hope this video helps. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Put in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel with Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.